The potion bubbled with a strange green luminescence, and Nora Zimmerman wondered if she had finally managed to kill something with her mixture rather than heal it. She lifted the wooden spoon from the iron pot and watched the thick liquid drip back down, her brow furrowed in concentration as the late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of her mother's apothecary shop in Rawhide, Nevada. The year was 1873, and the dusty mining town had seen better days since the silver veins started running thin, but people still got sick, still got hurt, and still needed remedies that the traveling doctors could not provide. Her mother, Margaret, had been the town's herbalist for 20 years before consumption took her the previous winter. Now, at 20 years old, Nora carried on the tradition alone, mixing tinctures and salves according to the leather-bound journal her mother had kept. The recipes were written in her mother's careful hand, annotations in the margins noting which plants grew best in the alkaline soil around Rawhide, and which had to be ordered from San Francisco at considerable expense. The bell above the shop door chimed, and Nora looked up from her work to see a mountain of a man ducking through the doorway. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the frame. His dark hair hung past his collar, tangled and wild, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. Muscles strained against his worn buckskin shirt, and his hands looked like they could snap a tree branch without effort. He carried himself with the cautious awareness of someone who spent more time with animals than people. "Can I help you?" Nora asked, wiping her hands on her apron. She tried not to stare, but men like this did not often come into town. He had the look of a trapper, someone who lived in the mountains surrounding the valley and only descended when supplies ran desperately low. The man's eyes, she noticed, were a startling shade of gray, like storm clouds over the Sierra Nevada. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, as if uncertain whether to advance further into the feminine space of dried herbs and glass bottles. "Heard there was someone in town who knew about healing plants." "That would be me." Nora gestured to the shelves lining the walls, packed with jars and bundles of dried vegetation. "What do you need?" "Not sick," he said quickly, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "Just wondering if you might have something for sleeping. Been having trouble with it lately." Nora studied him more carefully. Despite his intimidating size, she could see the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the tension in his massive shoulders. "Nightmares?" He nodded once, a short jerk of his head. "I can make you a tea," she said, moving toward one of her shelves. Her fingers traced over the labeled jars until she found what she wanted. Chamomile, valerian root, a touch of lavender, and something her mother had always added that the journal called mountain sage, a plant that grew only at high elevations. Nora had never quite understood why her mother included it, but the notation said it helped troubled souls find peace. She measured the ingredients carefully into a small cloth bag, then tied it with twine. "Steep this in hot water for 5 minutes before bed. Drink it slowly." She handed him the bag, and when his fingers brushed hers, she felt calluses thick as leather. "How much?" "2 bits." He dug into his pocket and produced the coins, placing them on the counter with surprising delicacy for such large hands. Then he hesitated, the bag of tea clutched in his fist. "What's your name?" "Nora Zimmerman. My mother was Margaret, the herbalist before me." "I heard about her passing. I'm sorry." He shifted his weight, and Nora realized he was uncomfortable with the social niceties of conversation. "I'm Seth Morrison. I have a cabin about 10 miles up in the mountains near the North Ridge." "That's quite a distance to come for tea." "Seemed worth it." He tucked the bag into his shirt pocket. "Thank you, Miss Zimmerman." She watched him leave, his broad back disappearing into the dusty street outside. The encounter left her strangely unsettled, though she could not pinpoint why. Perhaps it was simply the intensity of his presence, the way he seemed to fill the entire room despite saying so little. Nora returned to her potion, but found her concentration broken. The green liquid had cooled, and she decided to let it sit overnight before trying to determine if it was useful or if she needed to start over. She began the process of closing the shop for the evening, wiping down the counter and making sure all the candles were properly extinguished. Rawhide had burned once back in '68, and everyone remained cautious about fire. The next few days passed in their usual rhythm. Nora treated a child's fever, made a poultice for a miner's infected cut, and sold her standard remedies for stomach complaints and joint pain. She thought about Seth Morrison occasionally, wondering if her tea had helped him sleep, but she did not expect to see him again. Men like that were solitary creatures, and he had likely gotten what he needed and returned to his mountain solitude. Then, on the fourth day after his visit, he appeared again just before closing time. This time he carried a burlap sack, which he set gently on her counter. "The tea worked," he said without preamble. "Slept through the night for the first time in months." "I'm glad to hear it." Nora eyed the sack curiously. "Did you need more?" "Brought you something." He opened the sack to reveal fresh sage, the mountain variety her mother had prized. The plants were carefully bundled, roots still attached, soil clinging to them. "Saw you had this in the tea. Thought you might want more. It grows near my cabin." Nora reached out to touch the plants, impressed by their quality. "This is very kind of you, but you did not need to bring me anything." "Wanted to." He paused, then added, "That tea tasted like something I had not felt in a long time. Tasted like home." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them caught Nora off guard. She looked up at his bearded face and saw something vulnerable in those gray eyes. "Where is home for you, Mr. Morrison?" "Seth. Just Seth." He leaned against the counter and it creaked under his weight. "Used to have a cabin in Colorado with my family. My father was a trapper, taught me the trade. But there was a fever that went through our valley. Took my mother and my two sisters. My father never recovered from it. Not really. He got careless out in the wilderness, and one winter he just did not come back from a hunting trip." "I'm so sorry." "Was a long time ago. I was 18. Been on my own since then, moving from place to place. Ended up here 5 years back." He straightened up, as if embarrassed by the confession. "Anyway, the tea reminded me of something my mother used to make. Not the same, but close enough to feel like memory." Nora felt a tightness in her chest. She understood that particular kind of grief, the hollow ache of losing family. "My mother died last December. Sometimes I mix something and I swear I can hear her voice telling me to add more of this or less of that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood the weight of absence. "Would you like some tea now?" Nora asked impulsively. "I usually make myself a cup before I head upstairs for the evening. I live above the shop." Seth looked surprised but nodded. "I would like that." Nora filled her kettle from the water bucket and set it on the small stove in the corner of the shop. While it heated, she prepared 2 cups with a different blend, this one meant for relaxation rather than sleep. She added a bit of honey from the jar she kept for herself and handed him one of the steaming cups. Seth wrapped his large hands around the cup and breathed in the steam. When he drank, he did so carefully, mindful of the heat. "You have your mother's gift." "I hope so. I'm still learning from her journal. There are some remedies I have not tried yet because I cannot identify all the plants she listed, or I am not confident in the measurements." "I know most of the plants that grow in these mountains," Seth offered. "If you ever need help finding something, I could show you where they grow." The offer was casual, but Nora sensed the significance behind it. He was not the type of man to make gestures lightly. "I would appreciate that. There are a few I've been looking for." They talked until the light faded completely outside, and Nora had to light the lamps. Seth told her about the animals he saw in the mountains, the changing seasons at high elevation, the way the snow could come suddenly in October and not melt until May. Nora told him about the people of Rawhide, the small dramas and larger tragedies that made up life in a struggling mining town. She found him surprisingly easy to talk to once she realized he simply spoke less than most people, choosing his words with care. When he finally left, promising to return the following week with more sage, Nora found herself looking forward to his visit in a way that felt both exciting and unsettling. True to his word, Seth appeared the next week with another bundle of mountain sage, but he also brought other plants, ones he thought she might find useful. He stayed for tea again, and this time he asked her about the green potion she'd been making the day they met. "Still trying to figure that one out," Nora admitted. "It is supposed to be for lung complaints, but the color seems wrong. My mother's notation says it should be more golden." Seth peered at the pot which still sat on her work table. "What did you put in it?" She listed the ingredients, and he frowned. "You said golden seal root?" "Yes, from my stores. Can I see it?" Nora retrieved the jar and opened it for his inspection. Seth took a pinch and rubbed it between his fingers, then smelled it. This is not golden seal. This is Oregon grape root. They look similar dried, but Oregon grape will give you that green color. Relief washed through Nora. That explains everything. I must have mislabeled it when I transferred the stores last year. She found the correct jar and compared them side by side. You are absolutely right. My mother used to make medicines too, Seth explained. Different from yours, more in the Indian way. She learned from a Shoshone woman who lived near us. I picked up some of it. Over the following months, Seth's visits became regular. He would come to town every week or two, always bringing plants from the mountains, and they would share tea and conversation. Nora began to notice things about him she had missed in their first meeting, the way he moved with surprising grace for his size, the gentleness in his hands when he handled the plants, the intelligence in his observations about the natural world. She also began to notice the way her heart beat faster when she heard the bell above the door, the disappointment when it was not him, the care she took with her appearance on the days she thought he might visit. It was October when Seth invited her to come up to his cabin. The mountain sage is at its best right now, before the first frost. If you want to harvest it properly, I can show you where the best patches grow. Nora knew she should be cautious about going alone with a man into the wilderness, but she trusted Seth in a way she had not trusted anyone since her mother's death. When should we go? Tomorrow morning, if the weather holds. It will take us a few hours to get up there. Nora closed the shop early the next day and met Seth at the edge of town. He had brought a mule loaded with supplies and a gentle mare for her to ride. The morning air was crisp and cool, perfect for the climb into the mountains. As they ascended the winding trail, rawhide fell away below them until it looked like a collection of toy buildings scattered across the valley floor. The landscape transformed from sagebrush and scrub to pine forest, the air growing thinner and cleaner. Seth pointed out various plants as they rode, telling her their names and uses, both medicinal and practical. His cabin sat in a small clearing near a fast-moving stream, surrounded by towering pines. It was larger than Nora had expected, well built from thick logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows. A covered porch wrapped around the front, and she could see stacks of furs and wood piled neatly under the eaves. "This is beautiful," Nora said as she dismounted. Seth looked pleased by her reaction. "Built it myself over several winters. It is not fancy, but it keeps out the cold." Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished but immaculately clean. A large bed covered with furs dominated one corner, a stone fireplace the opposite wall. Shelves held dishes and supplies, and a sturdy table with 2 chairs sat near the window. Bundles of drying plants hung from the rafters, and Nora recognized some of them from her own stores. "I will make us some food before we go looking for the sage," Seth said. He moved around the small kitchen area with practiced efficiency, slicing bread and cheese, adding dried meat and apples to the plate. They ate sitting at the table, looking out at the clearing and the mountains beyond. "Do you ever get lonely up here?" Nora asked. Seth was quiet for a long moment. "Used to not mind it. Seemed easier to be alone than to risk caring about people again. But lately I've been thinking that maybe isolation is not the same thing as peace." Nora understood what he was not saying, the same thoughts that had been growing in her own mind. "I used to think I was content running the shop by myself, carrying on my mother's work. But the days feel longer now than they did before." Their eyes met across the table, and something shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since that first meeting in her shop. Seth cleared his throat and stood abruptly. "We should go find that sage before the afternoon clouds roll in." They spent the next several hours harvesting plants. Seth showed her the patches of mountain sage that grew in the rocky areas above the tree line, explaining how to tell the mature plants from the young ones, how to harvest sustainably so the patches would continue to thrive. Nora filled her gathering basket, grateful for the knowledge he shared so freely. On the way back to the cabin, heavy clouds began to darken the western sky. Seth eyed them with concern. Storm coming in. Might be the first snow of the season. Should we head back to town? We would not make it before it hits. Better to wait it out here. Nora knew she should feel anxious about spending the night in Seth's cabin, about what people in town might say, but she felt only a strange sense of rightness, as if this was where she was meant to be. The snow began falling just as they reached the cabin, fat flakes that quickly turned the world white. Seth brought in extra wood and built up the fire, while Nora prepared tea from the sage they had just harvested. The cabin grew warm and cozy as the storm raged outside, wind howling through the pines. "You can take the bed," Seth said as darkness fell. "I will sleep on the floor by the fire." "That hardly seems fair in your own home. I have slept in worse places. You are my guest." But Nora found sleep elusive, thinking about Seth lying on the hard floor when the bed was large enough for two. After an hour of tossing and turning, she called out softly, "Seth? Yes? This is ridiculous. The bed is big enough for both of us. We are both adults and it is cold." She heard him sit up in the darkness. "Nora, I do not want you to think—" "I know what you are," she interrupted. "You are a good man, and I trust you." After a long pause, she heard him stand and move toward the bed. He lay down on top of the furs, maintaining a careful distance between them. Nora could feel the warmth radiating from his large body, could hear his measured breathing. "Seth?" she whispered. "Yes? What did you mean when you said my tea tasted like home?" He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. Then his voice came through the darkness, rough with emotion. "It tasted like being cared for, like someone put thought into making something just for me. I had not felt that in a very long time." Nora rolled onto her side, facing him, even though she could barely see him in the dim light from the dying fire. "You do not have to be alone anymore, if you do not want to be." "What are you saying?" "I am saying that these months of your visits have been the best part of my days. I'm saying that I think about you when you are gone. I'm saying that maybe we are both tired of being lonely." Seth raised himself up on one elbow, and she could just make out the outline of his face, the glint of his eyes. "I'm not a man who has much to offer. I live in a cabin in the mountains. I trap and hunt for my living. I'm not educated or refined. I do not want educated or refined. I want honest and kind. I want someone who brings me plants from the mountains and drinks my tea and tells me it tastes like home." She reached out in the darkness and found his hand, rough and warm. "I want you." He moved then, closing the distance between them, his large hand coming up to cup her face with surprising tenderness. "I have wanted you since the moment I walked into your shop and saw you standing there with that green potion, looking so serious and determined. I just did not think someone like you would ever want someone like me." "Then you were not paying attention." He kissed her then, gentle at first, as if afraid she might break. But Nora pressed closer, her hands exploring the broad expanse of his chest, feeling the muscles that bunched and moved under his skin. He made a low sound in his throat and deepened the kiss, his arm coming around her waist to pull her against him. They spent the night learning each other, the storm forgotten outside as they generated their own warmth. Seth was tender and careful, constantly checking to make sure she was comfortable, that she wanted this. Nora had never felt so cherished, so desired, so completely safe with another person. In the morning, she woke wrapped in his arms, his large body curved protectively around hers. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in white. Sunlight streamed through the window, making the snow sparkle like diamonds. Seth stirred behind her and pressed a kiss to her shoulder. "Morning? Good morning. Do you regret this?" Nora turned in his arms to face him. In the daylight, she could see him clearly, the strong lines of his face, the gray eyes watching her with a mixture of hope and fear. "Not even a little bit." Relief washed over his features, and he pulled her close again. "I love you, Nora Zimmerman. I think I have since you first handed me that bag of tea and looked at me like I was a person instead of a wild thing that wandered in from the woods." "I love you too." She kissed him, taking her time about it. "What do we do now?" "Well, I suppose we should get you back to town before people start worrying, and then maybe we should talk about what comes next." What came next was a whirlwind of change. Nora returned to Rawhide with her harvest of mountain sage and Seth by her side. The townspeople gossiped, of course, about the herbalist's daughter and the wild mountain man, but Nora did not care. She was happier than she had been since her mother's death, and that happiness radiated from her in a way that even the most disapproving busybodies could not entirely condemn. Seth began splitting his time between his cabin and the room Nora rented above the shop. He helped her expand her stores of mountain plants and taught her techniques his mother had learned from the Shoshone. In turn, Nora taught him to read her mother's journal, helping him decipher the more complicated recipes. In December, on the anniversary of her mother's death, Seth asked Nora to marry him. They were in the shop mixing a batch of cough syrup for the winter ailments that always struck Rawhide this time of year. Seth had been quieter than usual all day, and when Nora asked what was wrong, he set down the jar he was holding and took both her hands in his. "I have been thinking about how you said your mother would want you to be happy. I have been thinking about how short life can be, how quickly the people we love can be taken from us." He squeezed her hands gently. "I do not want to waste any more time. Marry me, Nora. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy, keeping you safe, bringing you plants from the mountains and drinking your tea." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you." They out in January of 1874, in a simple ceremony at the small church in Rawhide. Nora wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, and carried a bouquet of dried mountain sage bound with lavender. Seth wore new clothes purchased from the general store, his hair and beard neatly trimmed for the occasion, though he still looked like he could wrestle a bear and win. The whole town came to the wedding, partly out of genuine goodwill and partly out of curiosity to see the hermit trapper who had captured the heart of their herbalist. Seth endured the attention with good grace, keeping Nora close by his side, his large hand dwarfing hers. After the ceremony, they held a small celebration at the shop, and Seth's usually stoic expression cracked into a genuine smile as he watched Nora laugh and talk with the townspeople. When she caught him staring, she crossed to him and took his hand. "What are you thinking about?" "How lucky I am. How I thought I would spend my whole life alone in those mountains, and then you mixed me a cup of tea and everything changed." "Maybe it was fate," Nora suggested. "Maybe my mother put that mountain sage in her recipe knowing that someday it would bring you to me." "I would like to think so." They spent their wedding night at the cabin in the mountains, snow falling softly outside as they lay wrapped in each other's arms. Seth built the fire up high, and they drank tea made from the sage they had harvested together, and Nora thought about how something as simple as herbs and hot water had brought her the greatest love of her life. The next few years passed in a rhythm of seasons and work. Nora continued to run the apothecary shop, her reputation as a skilled herbalist growing throughout the region. Seth trapped in the winter and helped her harvest plants in the spring and summer. They spent their weekends at the cabin, escaping the heat and dust of Rawhide for the cool peace of the high country. Their love deepened and matured, built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine partnership. Seth brought strength and protection, his presence a comfort when traveling merchants or rowdy miners came through town. Nora brought healing and wisdom, tending not just to physical ailments, but to the emotional wounds Seth still carried from his family's loss. In the spring of 1876, Nora discovered she was pregnant. She told Seth one evening as they sat on the porch of the cabin, watching the sunset over the mountains. He went very still, his hand frozen in the act of raising his cup to his lips. "A baby?" he finally managed. "Yes, due in late autumn, I think." Seth set down his cup with shaking hands and pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. She felt wetness on her neck and realized he was crying. "I never thought I would have this. A family again. A home. You do now. We both do." Their son was born in November, squalling and healthy, with a thick shock of dark hair and his father's gray eyes. They named him Daniel, after Seth's father, and Seth held the tiny bundle with an expression of such fierce love and protectiveness that Nora fell in love with him all over again. Daniel was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Margaret, after Nora's mother. The little girl had Nora's dark curls and a stubborn streak a mile wide. Seth doted on both his children with a devotion that sometimes moved Nora to tears, watching this large, powerful man reduced to gentleness by his babies. As the children grew, the cabin in the mountains became their true home, though they kept the shop in Rawhide as well. Nora trained an assistant, a young woman named Sarah who showed promise with herbs, to run the shop during the weeks they spent in the high country. Seth expanded the cabin, adding rooms for the growing family and a dedicated workroom for Nora's more complicated preparations. Daniel learned to track and hunt from his father, growing strong and capable under Seth's patient instruction. Margaret showed her mother's gift for healing, spending hours watching Nora mix remedies and asking endless questions about plants and their properties. Both children grew up bilingual in a sense, fluent in both their mother's medical knowledge and their father's wilderness skills. In the summer of 1882, when Daniel was 6 and Margaret 4, Seth took Nora on a pilgrimage to Colorado, to the valley where he had grown up. They left the children with Sarah and her husband, who had become trusted friends, and made the long journey east. The old cabin was still standing, though nature had begun reclaiming it. Seth walked through the overgrown clearing slowly, pointing out where things had been his mother's garden, the shed where his father kept the furs, the tree he and his sisters had climbed. Nora held his hand and let him talk, understanding that he needed to do this, to reconcile his past with his present. That night, they camped near the ruins, and Seth made tea from the supplies Nora had brought. As he drank, he smiled. "Still tastes like home, but home is different now. Home is not a place I lost. It is the place we built together." "And it always will be," Nora promised. They returned to Nevada with Seth lighter somehow, as if laying those old ghosts to rest had freed him to fully embrace the life he had built. He threw himself into his family with renewed energy, teaching Daniel everything he knew about surviving in the mountains, helping Margaret identify every plant within riding distance of their cabin, and loving Nora with a steady devotion that never wavered. In 1885, Nora gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas. He was a quiet baby, content to watch the world with solemn eyes that reminded Nora of Seth's expression when they had first met. Seth, now in his late 30s and with strands of silver beginning to show in his dark hair, adapted to another infant with the ease of experience. The years rolled on, marked by the changing seasons and the small joys and challenges of family life. Daniel grew into a young man with his father's size and strength, deciding to become a guide for hunting parties in the mountains. Margaret, at 16, was already known throughout the region for her healing skills, having surpassed even Nora's knowledge in some areas. Thomas, at 12, showed a talent for drawing, spending hours sketching the plants and animals around their home with startling accuracy. In the autumn of 1897, Nora and Seth celebrated their 23rd wedding anniversary. They were in their 40s now, gray threading through their hair, lines etched by sun and laughter marking their faces. Their children were grown, or nearly so, building their own lives. They sat on the porch of the cabin, wrapped in blankets against the autumn chill, drinking tea from mountain sage that they had harvested together back in the spring. The valley below was touched with gold and orange, aspens turning with the season. "Do you remember the first time you came into my shop?" Nora asked, nestled against Seth's side. "Of course. I remember thinking you were the prettiest thing I had ever seen. All serious and focused on that green potion of yours. I remember being terrified to talk to you. You did not seem terrified. I am good at hiding things like that." He kissed the top of her head. "I remember taking that first sip of your tea and feeling something shift inside me, like I had been holding my breath for 10 years and finally let it out. It was just chamomile and valerian and a few other things. It was more than that. It was care. It was hope. It was the first step toward everything we have now." He gestured at the cabin, the mountains, the life they had built. "All of this started with a cup of tea." Nora turned her face up to his. "I love you, Seth Morrison, just as much now as I did that night in the snow when I first told you." "I love you more," he countered, then laughed when she swatted his arm. "Or at least equally. Is that acceptable?" "It will do." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Inside the cabin, they could hear Thomas working on his drawings, the scratch of his pencil on paper. Daniel and Margaret would be joining them for dinner tomorrow, bringing news from town and the wider world. "What do you think happens next?" Nora asked. "We are not young anymore. The children will have their own families soon. What comes after?" Seth was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think we keep doing what we have always done. We harvest the plants in spring, we help people who need healing, we drink tea and watch the seasons change. Maybe we teach what we know to anyone who wants to learn. Maybe we just enjoy being together." "That sounds perfect. And wherever we are, as long as we are together, it will taste like home." Nora smiled and settled deeper into his embrace. The tea had long since cooled in their cups, but it did not matter. They had each other, they had their family, they had built something lasting out of grief and loneliness and a chance encounter in an apothecary shop. The mountains stood eternal around them, the same peaks Seth had roamed alone all those years ago. But he was not alone anymore, and neither was she. They had found each other in a harsh land during a hard time, two lonely souls who discovered that healing came in many forms and love could bloom even in the wilderness. As winter approached and the first snows began to fall, Seth and Nora prepared the cabin for the cold months ahead. They had done this dance so many times now that they moved in perfect synchronization, each knowing what the other needed without having to ask. Seth chopped and stacked wood until they had enough to last through the heaviest storms. Nora preserved herbs and made enough remedies to last them through the months when nothing grew. Daniel came to visit in early December, bringing news that he was courting a girl from one of the neighboring valleys. Her name was Elizabeth, and from the way his eyes lit up when he talked about her, Nora knew this was serious. She and Seth exchanged knowing glances, remembering their own courtship, their own discovery of love. "I want to ask her to marry me," Daniel confessed over dinner, "but I do not have much to offer her. A guide's life is not easy." Seth reached across the table and gripped his son's shoulder. "If she loves you, that is all that matters. Your mother married a trapper who lived alone in the mountains. We made it work because we wanted to be together more than we wanted comfort or security." "Your father is right," Nora added. "Love is not about what you have. It is about who you are and what you are willing to build together." Daniel married Elizabeth in the spring of 1898, and Nora cried during the ceremony, remembering her own wedding day. Seth held her hand, his grip strong and steady, and whispered, "Our boy is starting his own adventure now." Margaret followed a year later, marrying a doctor who had come to Rawhide to set up a practice. Nora had been teaching him about herbal remedies, and he had fallen hard for her talented, opinionated daughter. Their wedding was larger than Daniel's, held in the church with half the town in attendance. Margaret wore a dress of cream silk, and when her new husband looked at her, Nora saw the same devotion she had seen in Seth's eyes all those years ago. Thomas, at 14, declared that he had no interest in marriage anytime soon and planned to travel to San Francisco to study art. Nora and Seth supported his dreams, though Nora worried about her youngest child going so far away. "He will be fine," Seth assured her. "We raised them to be strong and capable. They can handle whatever comes." In the summer of 1900, on a warm June day that smelled of pine and wildflowers, Nora and Seth became grandparents for the first time. Daniel and Elizabeth had a son, a healthy baby with his grandfather's gray eyes and his grandmother's dark hair. They named him Seth, after his grandfather, and when the elder Seth held his namesake for the first time, tears streamed down his weathered face. "I never imagined this," he told Nora that night as they lay in bed. "When I was alone in these mountains, barely surviving, I never could have imagined having children and grandchildren, a wife I love more than my own life. How did I get this lucky?" "We both got lucky," Nora corrected. "We found each other when we both needed finding." Margaret and her husband welcomed twin girls the following year, and suddenly the cabin rang with children's laughter again on the weekends when the families gathered. Nora taught her granddaughters about herbs, while Seth showed young Seth how to track deer through the forest. The cycle of knowledge passed down through generations, just as it should be. Thomas returned from San Francisco in 1903, having made a name for himself as an illustrator of botanical texts. He had drawings from his time in California that took Nora's breath away, accurate and beautiful depictions of plants she had only read about. He also brought a young woman named Claire, a writer he had met in the city, and Nora knew immediately that her youngest had found his match. They were married that autumn in a small ceremony at the cabin, with only family present. Thomas and Claire planned to split their time between San Francisco and Nevada, using the cabin as a retreat when they needed inspiration for their collaborative books on the plants of the American West. As Nora entered her 50s, she began to slow down, letting Margaret take over more of the work at the apothecary shop in Rawhide. Her hands ached sometimes from the years of grinding herbs and mixing medicines, and climbing to the high elevations where the best plants grew became more difficult. Seth, too, showed his age, moving a little stiffer in the mornings, his thick hair now more silver than dark. But they were content. More than content, they were happy in a deep, abiding way that came from a life well lived and love well tended. In the spring of 1906, on a mild afternoon when the aspens were just beginning to leaf out, Nora was harvesting herbs in the clearing near the cabin when she heard Seth call her name. There was something in his voice that made her drop her basket and run. She found him sitting on the porch steps, his face pale, one hand pressed to his chest. Terror gripped her heart. "Seth, what is wrong?" "Just a pain. It will pass." But it did not pass quickly, and Nora recognized the signs of a heart struggling under strain. She got him inside and into bed, then brewed the strongest heart tonic she knew, a mixture her mother had used for the elderly miners whose hearts had been weakened by years of hard labor. Seth drank it obediently, his gray eyes never leaving her face. "I am not ready to leave you yet." "Then do not." Nora's voice shook. "You promised me a lifetime, Seth Morrison. I am holding you to that." He managed a weak smile. "Yes, madam." She sent Thomas, who was visiting, to fetch Margaret and her doctor husband. They came quickly, and while the doctor examined Seth, Nora paced the cabin like a caged animal, unable to sit still, unable to do anything but worry. The doctor emerged from the bedroom with a grave expression. "His heart is weakened. He needs rest, no strenuous activity. I have given him medicine that should help, but at his age, these things are unpredictable." Over the following weeks, Seth followed doctor's orders, resting and taking his medicine and driving Nora crazy with his compliance. "This is not like you," she told him one afternoon. "You hate being still." "I hate the thought of leaving you more," he replied simply. "So I will sit here and drink your terrible-tasting medicine and rest, because I want as many more years with you as I can get." Slowly, Seth recovered his strength, though he never quite returned to his former vitality. He could no longer make the long treks into the high country, could not chop wood for hours or carry heavy loads of furs. But he adapted, finding new ways to be useful, teaching his grandchildren, helping Nora with the lighter tasks around the cabin. They celebrated their 33rd wedding anniversary in January of 1907, surrounded by their children and grandchildren. Young Seth was now 7 years old and already showing signs of becoming as large as his grandfather. Margaret's twins were 6, bright and curious, already pestering their grandmother to teach them everything she knew about healing. Thomas and Claire had a 3-year-old daughter named Rose, who loved to sit on her grandfather's lap and listen to his stories about the mountains. That night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Nora and Seth sat by the fire, drinking tea made from the mountain sage that Margaret had harvested for them. "Remember when you first tasted this?" Nora asked, taking Seth's hand in hers. His hands were still large and strong, though marked now with age spots and scars from a lifetime of hard work. "I remember everything about that day. I remember being afraid to come into your shop, afraid you would laugh at a mountain man asking for help with nightmares." He squeezed her hand gently. "And then you handed me that tea, and you looked at me with such kindness, such understanding. I started falling in love with you right then, though I did not know it yet." "When did you know?" Seth thought about it. "The first time I brought you mountain sage, I saw how your face lit up, how excited you were about the plants, and I thought, I want to see that expression every day for the rest of my life. That is when I knew." "I knew earlier," Nora confessed. "The second time you came to the shop. You were so uncomfortable making conversation, but you tried anyway because you are a good man who does things properly. I thought, this is someone I could trust with my heart." "And was I? Trustworthy with your heart?" "The most trustworthy person I have ever known." She leaned against him, feeling the steady beat of his heart, grateful for every beat, every moment they had together. "You gave me a life I never imagined possible. You gave me love and children and grandchildren. You gave me a home in these mountains that I love almost as much as I love you." "Only almost," he teased. "Nothing could ever match how much I love you." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside, snow began to fall, the first flakes of what would become a heavy storm. But inside the cabin they were warm and safe, surrounded by the life they had built together. Seth's health remained delicate but stable over the next few years. He had to be careful, could not overexert himself, but he was still present, still engaged with his family and the world around him. Nora fussed over him constantly, making him special teas and tonics, monitoring his diet, insisting he rest. "You are worse than any doctor," Seth complained, good-naturedly, after Nora scolded him for trying to stack firewood. "I am your wife, and I am keeping you alive, so you will listen to me." "Yes, dear." Their grandchildren grew, and more were added. Daniel and Elizabeth had 2 more children, daughters who looked like their mother, but had their father's steady temperament. Margaret's twins grew into beautiful young women with their grandmother's gift for healing. Thomas and Claire had another child, a son they named Matthew, who showed every sign of being as talented an artist as his father. In 1912, when Nora was 60 and Seth was 63, they attended young Seth's graduation from school. The boy, now 12 years old and already towering over his grandmother, planned to follow in his grandfather's footsteps as a mountain guide. Seth, the elder, watched with pride as his grandson spoke confidently about his plans for the future. "We did good," Seth whispered to Nora during the ceremony. "Our family is strong and capable and kind. We gave them that." "We did," Nora agreed, her heart full to bursting. That summer, the entire family gathered at the cabin for a reunion. Children ran through the clearing, playing the same games Daniel and Margaret and Thomas had played decades before. The adults sat on the expanded porch, talking and laughing, sharing stories and memories. Seth watched it all from his rocking chair, Nora beside him, both of them marveling at what they had created. "Thank you," Seth said suddenly. Nora looked at him quizzically. "For what?" "For giving me a reason to come down from my mountain, for making me that first cup of tea, for loving me even when I was rough and awkward and did not know how to be part of the world anymore." He gestured at the scene before them. "For all of this." Tears pricked Nora's eyes. "You gave me just as much. More, maybe. You taught me that love is not just about healing others, but about letting yourself be healed. You showed me that strength and gentleness can exist in the same person. You made me feel safe and cherished every single day." Daniel called out then, asking Seth to tell the grandchildren about the time he tracked a mountain lion for 3 days in the middle of winter. Seth rose, steady on his feet despite his years, and went to join his family. Nora watched him settle into his chair with grandchildren clustered around him, his deep voice beginning the tale they had all heard before, but never tired of hearing. She thought about that first day in her shop, mixing her potion and wondering if she would ever be as skilled as her mother. She thought about Seth ducking through her doorway, looking uncomfortable and desperate and somehow exactly right. She thought about the journey that had brought them from 2 lonely people to this moment, surrounded by the fruit of their love. Margaret came to sit beside her mother. "You're thinking deep thoughts. Just reflecting on how strange life is, how one small moment can change everything." "What moment changed everything for you?" Nora smiled. "The moment I handed your father a bag of tea and he told me it tasted like home. That was when I knew, even though I did not realize it yet, that he was going to be my home." Margaret leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "That is beautiful, Mama. I hope I love my husband half as well as you love Papa after all our years together. The secret is choosing someone who makes you want to be better, kinder, stronger. Your father did that for me every single day." As the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, the family gathered for dinner. Long tables had been set up in the clearing, laden with food everyone had contributed to. Seth said grace, his voice strong despite his weakened heart, thanking God for family and health and the beautiful land they called home. After dinner, as the children roasted marshmallows over the fire and the adults talked in quiet voices, Nora made Seth his evening tea. She used the mountain sage they had first harvested together all those years ago, adding the other herbs that had become their tradition. She handed him the steaming cup and watched as he took his first sip. "Still tastes like home," he said softly. "After all these years, it still tastes exactly like home." "That is because home is not a flavor," Nora replied. "It is a feeling, and that feeling is us." Seth pulled her close and she rested her head on his broad shoulder, listening to the sound of his heartbeat, slower than it once was, but still strong, still steady. Around them, their family laughed and talked, the sound of multiple generations connected by love and shared history. The years continued their march, as years always do. Seth's health remained fragile, requiring careful management, but he persevered with the same stubbornness that had kept him alive in the mountains all those years ago. Nora continued to work, though she let Margaret handle more and more of the difficult cases. Her hands were not as steady as they once were, and her eyes tired easily when reading her mother's journal. But they still had each other, still had their morning tea ritual, still sat on the porch every evening and watched the sun set over the mountains. They still held hands when they walked the short distance Nora would allow Seth to go. They still kissed goodnight and good morning, and sometimes just because. In the winter of 1914, a particularly harsh storm trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. Thomas had been visiting, and he got snowed in with them, which turned out to be a blessing. Seth had another hard episode on the second day, and Thomas was able to ride out once the storm cleared to fetch Margaret and the doctor. Nora spent those hours before help arrived, doing everything she knew to do, giving Seth every remedy in her arsenal, praying to a God she sometimes doubted, but always hoped was listening. Seth remained conscious throughout, his gray eyes fixed on her face. "I'm still not ready to leave you," he whispered. "Then stay," Nora commanded, though her voice broke. "Stay with me, Seth. Please." He stayed. The doctor said it was nothing short of miraculous that a man Seth's age with a heart that weak should not have survived. But Nora knew better. Seth stayed because he had promised her a lifetime, and Seth Morrison never broke his promises. Spring came eventually, as it always did, bringing new life to the mountains. The wildflowers bloomed, the streams ran high with snowmelt, and the mountain sage began to grow in the rocky places high above the tree line. Margaret offered to harvest it for them, but Seth insisted on making the trip one more time. "Let me help you," he asked Nora. "Let me go with you to the places we used to go. I will be careful, I promise." Against her better judgment, Nora agreed. They rode slowly up the mountain trail, stopping often to rest, taking their time. Seth could not climb as he once had, so they stayed at the lower elevations where the sage also grew, not as lush, but still usable. As Nora harvested, Seth sat on a flat rock, looking out over the valley below. "I've been thinking," he said after a while. "About what?" "About how grateful I am. I spent so many years alone, thinking that was my lot in life, that I did not deserve anything better after losing my family. And then you gave me a second chance. You gave me love and children and more happiness than any one man has a right to." Nora set down her basket and came to sit beside him. "You gave me all of that too. We gave it to each other. I know I have not been easy to live with this past few years with my health problems and my limitations. Seth Morrison, you stop that right now. You have been the same wonderful man you have always been. A few health problems do not change who you are to me." He took her hand and raised it to his lips, kissing her knuckles gently. "I love you, Nora. I need you to know that. No matter what happens, no matter when my heart finally gives out, I love you with everything I am." "I know," Nora whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I've always known, and I love you the same way." They sat together on that mountain, surrounded by the sage that had brought them together, and watched the clouds drift by. Eventually, they made their way back down to the cabin, tired but content. Seth's heart held on for 5 more years, beating stubbornly through seasons and storms. He saw all his grandchildren grow into young adults, saw some of them marry and start families of their own. He held his first great-grandchild, Daniel's grandson, and marveled at the continuation of the life he and Nora had built. In the autumn of 1919, as the aspens turned gold and the air grew crisp with the promise of winter, Seth's heart finally gave out. He died in his sleep peacefully with Nora beside him. His last words, spoken just before he drifted off, were, "Thank you for the tea. It still tastes like home." Nora held his hand as his breathing slowed and then stopped, as the man who had been her partner for 45 years slipped away. She did not cry at first, too shocked by the finality of it, even though she had known this day was coming. The family gathered for the funeral, and they buried Seth on the mountain he loved, in a clearing near the cabin overlooking the valley. Everyone who spoke talked about his kindness, his strength, his devotion to his family. Nora spoke last, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Seth was a man who knew loss and loneliness, who had every reason to give up on the world. But he did not. He kept going, kept surviving, until the day he walked into my mother's shop and asked for tea to help him sleep. I gave him herbs and hot water, and he gave me a lifetime of love. He taught our children to be strong and kind. He showed our grandchildren what it means to be devoted to family. He gave me more happiness than I ever thought possible. And every day, every single day, he made me feel like I was home. After the funeral, after everyone had left, Nora returned to the cabin. She walked through the rooms that echoed with Seth's absence, touching things he had built and made, remembering. She found the journal where she had recorded all their years together, the recipes they had developed, the life they had shared. That night, she made herself a cup of tea from the mountain sage Seth had harvested with her that last spring. As she drank, she closed her eyes and remembered the first time he had tasted her tea, the wonder in his voice when he said it tasted like home. "You were my home too," she whispered to the empty cabin. "You will always be my home." Nora lived for 10 more years after Seth's death, continuing to work with Margaret and the younger generation of healers. She spent her days mixing medicines and teaching what she knew, passing down the knowledge her mother had given her and the wisdom Seth had added to it. She spent her evenings on the porch, looking at the mountains and talking to Seth as if he were still beside her. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren visited often, and she told them stories about their grandfather, making sure they knew the kind of man he had been. She taught them to make tea from mountain sage, explaining how that simple plant had changed her entire life. In the spring of 1929, as the wildflowers began to bloom and the streams ran high with snowmelt, Nora Zimmerman Morrison died peacefully in her sleep, in the cabin Seth had built, surrounded by the life they had created together. She was 76 years old. They buried her beside Seth, on the mountain overlooking the valley. Margaret stood over her parents' graves and felt her heart break and heal at the same time, knowing that they were together again, knowing that their love story was complete. "They were lucky to find each other," Elizabeth said, standing beside her sister-in-law. "We were lucky they found each other," Margaret corrected. "All of us. We exist because a lonely mountain man walked into a shop and asked for tea, and my mother had the wisdom to see past his rough exterior to the good man underneath. We exist because they chose love over loneliness, because they built something beautiful out of grief and loss." Young Seth, now 29, and the spitting image of his grandfather, placed flowers on both graves. Grandmother always said that grandfather told her the tea tasted like home. I never understood what that meant when I was little. "What does it mean now?" his wife asked. "It means he found where he belonged. After years of wandering, after losing everything, he found the one person who made him feel like he had a place in the world again, and she found the same thing in him." He straightened up and looked around at the gathered family, at the dozens of people who traced their existence back to a cup of tea and a lonely man and a kind woman. "They built this for us. All of this. Every single one of us is here because they loved each other." The family returned to the cabin after the funeral and shared a meal, as Seth and Nora would have wanted. Thomas, now in his 50s, made tea from the mountain sage using his mother's recipe. He poured cups for everyone, and as they drank, he raised his cup in a toast. "To Seth and Nora Morrison, who showed us what love looks like, who taught us that home is not a place but a person, who built something that will last long after we are all gone." "To Seth and Nora," everyone echoed, and in that moment, drinking tea made from mountain sage, surrounded by family in a cabin built by love, they all understood what Seth had meant all those years ago when he said it tasted like home. Because home was not the flavor of the herbs or the warmth of the liquid. Home was the feeling of being exactly where you belonged, with exactly who you belonged with, knowing that you were loved and that you loved in return. The cabin still stands today, maintained by generations of descendants who come to the mountains to remember where their family began. The apothecary shop in Rawhide eventually closed, but the recipes Nora developed are still used, passed down through Margaret's line of healers. The mountain sage still grows in the rocky places above the tree line, and those who know its story sometimes harvest it and make tea, hoping to catch a taste of the love that started it all. Because that is what endures in the end. Not the buildings or the businesses, or even the people themselves. What endures is the love they created, the family they built, the lesson they taught about choosing connection over isolation, about having the courage to let someone in even when you have been hurt, about finding home in another person's heart. Seth and Nora's story became a legend in their family, told and retold to each new generation. The children learned about the mountain man who came down from his solitary cabin seeking help with nightmares, and the herbalist's daughter who saw past his rough exterior to the lonely heart underneath. They learned about the tea that tasted like home, about the years of devotion and partnership, about the love that survived hardship and illness, and finally death itself. And every generation had couples who looked at each other and said, "I want what they had. I want a love that strong, that sure, that lasting." Some found it, some did not, but they all tried, inspired by the example of two people who had every reason to stay isolated and protected, but chose vulnerability and connection instead. Margaret lived to be 87, carrying on her mother's work until the very end. Daniel became a legendary guide, known throughout Nevada and California for his skill and integrity. Thomas's books on Western plants became the definitive texts on the subject, illustrated with drawings that captured not just the appearance of the plants, but their essence, their spirit. And all of them, every single one of Seth and Nora's descendants, knew the story of the tea that tasted like home. They knew that love could heal even the deepest wounds, that two lonely people could find each other even in the vast wilderness of the American West, that something as simple as herbs and hot water could change the course of a life. Years turned to decades, decades to a century. The Wild West became the tame West, then just the West. Rawhide faded into a ghost town as the mines played out and people moved to larger cities. But the mountains remained, eternal and unchanging, and the cabin on the ridge stood as testament to the love that had built it. On a summer day in the early 21st century, a descendant of Seth and Nora Morrison, a woman named Emma who had inherited Margaret's healing gift, climbed to the clearing where her ancestors were buried. She brought mountain sage and made tea the old way, using the recipe that had been passed down through 5 generations. As she drank, looking out over the valley that had changed so much and yet remained fundamentally the same, she thought about the great-great-grandparents she had never met but felt like she knew. She thought about the courage it took to love when you had already lost so much. She thought about the strength required to build a life in such a harsh and unforgiving place. And she thought about how their love had rippled forward through time, creating family and connection and a legacy that would outlast stone and wood and even memory itself. The tea did taste like home, she realized, not because of the flavor, but because home was this connection to the past, this link to people who had loved fiercely and well, this knowledge that she came from something strong and true and beautiful. "Thank you," Emma whispered to the graves, to the mountains, to the memory of two people who had turned loneliness into love and grief into joy. "Thank you for showing us how it is done." The wind rustled through the aspens, carrying the scent of sage and pine, and for just a moment, Emma could have sworn she heard an answer, a deep voice saying, "It tasted like home," and a woman's laughter, warm and full of love. Then the moment passed, but the feeling remained. The knowledge that love like Seth and Nora's did not die. It transformed. It passed down through generations. It became part of the very fabric of a family's identity. It taught children how to be strong and kind. It showed young people what partnership looked like. It gave the elderly comfort in knowing they came from something good. And every now and then, when someone made tea from mountain sage and took that first sip, they understood for just a moment what Seth Morrison had felt that day in 1873 when he walked into an apothecary shop and a young woman handed him hope in a cloth bag. They understood what it meant for something to taste like home. Because home was not a place you found. It was a place you built, with someone else, one day at a time, one cup of tea at a time, one act of love and devotion at a time. It was the accumulation of small moments and large gestures, of weathering storms together and celebrating sunshine, of choosing each other again and again and again. That was what Seth and Nora had understood. That was what they had built. That was what they had left behind for all the generations who came after. And in the end, that was everything.